Why do some people stay calm during chaos, while everyone else panics? And why does that pattern appear again and again in Generation X? Something goes wrong. A project suddenly falls apart. The deadline is closer than anyone expected. People start reacting immediately. Someone raises their voice. Someone else starts blaming the team. Another person begins talking too fast, trying to fix everything at once. The room slowly fills with tension. You can almost feel the stress spreading. But then you notice one person reacting differently. They don't rush to speak. They don't react emotionally. They pause. They watch what everyone else is doing. They listen carefully before saying anything. And when they finally speak, the words are simple, clear, practical. Sometimes it's the first thing that actually moves the situation forward. You may have seen this kind of moment before. If this sounds familiar, you are not alone. Many people recognize this exact scene, and when they think back on it, they often realize something interesting. The calm person in the room is often from the same generation, Generation X. Not always, but often enough that the pattern becomes hard to ignore. And that raises a deeper question, because behavior like this rarely appears randomly. Psychologically speaking, patterns like this are usually learned somewhere. But the real explanation begins much earlier than most people expect. It begins in childhood. And once you understand what childhood looked like for Generation X, their behavior today makes much more sense. To understand Generation X, we have to step back into a childhood that looks very different from today. Before smartphones, before social media, before the internet connected every moment of our lives. Imagine being about 9 years old in the early 1980s. School ends in the afternoon. You ride your bike home. You open the front door with a key hanging around your neck. The house is empty. No parents yet. No phone buzzing. No screen waiting to entertain you. Just silence. For millions of kids growing up in the 1970s and 80s, this wasn't unusual. It was normal. They were known as latchkey kids, children who came home from school and spent hours alone until their parents returned from work. And those quiet hours shaped something important. You had to figure things out on your own. How to deal with boredom, how to fix small problems, how to make decisions without asking someone immediately. Many people don't realize how powerful those small moments can be. But childhood environments quietly train the brain, day after day, year after year. You may have noticed something about people who grew up during that time. They often seem comfortable being alone with their thoughts. They don't always rush to fill the silence. They don't panic when things slow down. Because for them, quiet moments weren't unusual. They were part of everyday life. But something else was happening during that era. And this is where things start to get more interesting. Generation X wasn't just growing up with independence. They were growing up during uncertainty. And that combination would shape their psychology in ways most people never notice. Independence can shape confidence, but independence without stability can shape something deeper. And I think this is one of the biggest reasons Generation X is often misunderstood. Because during the years they were growing up, the world around them was shifting. Economies slowed down. Factories closed. Companies that once promised lifelong careers began laying people off. Many children heard conversations at the dinner table about job security, about rising prices, about uncertainty. Even if they didn't fully understand the details, they understood the tone. Something wasn't stable anymore. And children are surprisingly sensitive to emotional atmospheres like that. You may have experienced something similar yourself, sitting quietly while adults talk about problems they think you don't understand, but you still feel the tension. You still notice the worry. And over time, that environment quietly teaches the brain a new expectation. The world might not always be predictable. This is where things get interesting. Because when people grow up expecting stability, sudden chaos feels shocking. But when people grow up expecting uncertainty, chaos feels familiar. Many people from Generation X learned this pattern early. Plans don't always work.
Systems don't always protect you. Things can change quickly. And when you internalize that message long enough, something subtle happens. You begin to rely less on the system and more on yourself. But this psychological adaptation has another side, because learning to depend on yourself often means learning to manage emotions internally. And this is where many people begin to misunderstand Generation X. Many people describe Generation X with the same few words: independent, resilient, sometimes even emotionally distant. But here is the strange part. Most people see the behavior. Very few people ask where the behavior came from. Because when you look closer, something unusual appears. Many Generation X adults developed the habit of processing emotions quietly. Not because they lack emotion, but because they learned early that emotional reactions didn't always solve problems. You may have noticed this pattern before. Something stressful happens. Some people react immediately. They speak louder. They move faster. They try to change the situation right away. But others do something different. They pause. They observe the room. They take in information before responding. And this small difference changes everything. Psychologists sometimes describe this as emotional regulation through observation. Instead of reacting first, the brain slows down and gathers information. This pattern is common among people who had to become emotionally self-reliant early in life, and Generation X often experienced this environment. But something else was happening during this era, and now is where things start to get more interesting. When people repeatedly handle problems on their own, their internal dialogue becomes stronger. They start asking themselves questions. What actually matters here? What can I control? What can't I control? Over time, this quiet internal problem-solving becomes automatic. It becomes a habit. But this habit can sometimes look like emotional distance from the outside. Someone speaks less. They reveal less. They react more slowly. And other people misinterpret that silence. They assume indifference. But the reality is usually different. Silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes silence is processing. Sometimes silence is emotional calculation. And sometimes silence simply means the brain is thinking before reacting. And many people who grew up during the Generation X era developed exactly that habit. But here's something most people never realize. The environment that created this psychological style no longer exists in quite the same way. Today, children grow up in a world of constant stimulation. Screens, notifications, instant responses. Emotions are often expressed immediately and publicly. But Generation X developed emotionally in a slower environment.
An environment where silence lasted longer, where problems were solved privately, where mistakes disappeared with time instead of staying online forever. And that difference quietly shaped how they respond to the world today. But the deeper psychological explanation goes even further, because another mental pattern also developed during this time, and it explains something many people notice about Generation X: their skepticism. Many people describe Generation X as skeptical, sometimes even cynical, but the real explanation is more psychological than personal. Because people who grow up during periods of instability develop a specific survival strategy. It pays more attention to potential threats. Psychologists call this negativity bias. The human brain tends to notice and remember negative experiences more strongly than positive ones. This bias exists in everyone, but it becomes stronger when people grow up in uncertain environments. Generation X experienced many signals of instability during their formative years: economic recessions, corporate layoffs, political scandals. Institutions that once seemed reliable suddenly looked fragile, and the brain adapts to patterns like this. It begins to watch more carefully, to question more quickly, to trust more slowly. But here's where people often misunderstand the behavior. Skepticism is not the same as pessimism. Skepticism is observation. It is the brain asking a simple question: is this reliable? Many Generation X adults learn to ask that question automatically, not loudly, quietly. They listen, They observe patterns. They compare what people say with what people actually do. And over time, that habit becomes a mental filter. This is why many people from this generation appear less impressed by authority. Titles alone do not automatically create trust. Competence does. Experience does. Consistency does. And another psychological pattern is happening at the same time, something called cognitive dissonance awareness. When words and actions don't match, the brain notices the tension. Some people ignore that tension, but people who grew up observing unstable systems often become highly sensitive to them. They notice contradictions faster. Promises that feel too confident, stories that don't fully add up. And this mental habit can lead to something that looks like distance, but in reality, it is simply pattern recognition. But here's the strange part. This same psychological habit also contributes to something else, the calm we talked about earlier. Because once the brain expects uncertainty, uncertainty no longer feels shocking. And that realization leads to the most important insight in the entire story. And this leads to the most important realization in the entire story. Generation X isn't calm because life wasn't easier. They're calm because life trained them early. They didn't learn calm from comfort. They learned calm from repetition. Independence came earlier. Uncertainty came earlier. Responsibility came earlier. And when the brain experiences those patterns during childhood, it adapts. It learns to slow down before reacting. It learns to observe before trusting. It learns to process emotions internally before expressing them. What looks like emotional distance is often emotional stability. What looks like skepticism is often pattern recognition. And what looks like silence is often careful thinking. Many people misunderstand this generation because their behavior doesn't always match modern expectations. Today, emotional expression is fast, immediate, public. But Generation X developed emotionally in a slower environment, an environment where problems were solved privately, where silence lasted longer, where independence wasn't a philosophy, it was simply part of daily life. And this shaped something powerful, a psychological habit of staying steady when things become uncertain, not because they ignore problems, but because they've seen instability before. So when chaos appears, their brain doesn't panic. It recognizes the pattern, and that recognition creates calm. Once you start noticing these patterns, Generation X becomes easier to understand. They remain calm during chaos, their quiet independence, their tendency to observe before reacting. None of these behaviors appeared randomly. They were shaped slowly by a particular environment, a particular era, and a particular kind of childhood that doesn't exist in quite the same way anymore. Sometimes the habits we think are personality traits, they're actually adaptations, ways the mind learned to navigate the world it grew up in. Generation X didn't develop their mindset through theory, they developed it through experience, through quiet afternoons alone, through uncertainty in the world around them, through learning early on that stability is never guaranteed. And when the brain grows up with that understanding, something subtle changes. Instead of panicking when things fall apart, it pauses, it watches, it adjusts. And that quiet adjustment often looks like calm, but underneath it is something deeper, a lifetime of pattern recognition. And once you see that pattern, Generation X no longer looks distant. They simply look prepared. And maybe that's the deeper lesson here. Human behavior often makes sense once you understand the environment that shaped it. And maybe there's another small takeaway from the story of Generation X. The ability to stay calm when things start getting a little chaotic. The habit of figuring things out on your own, even when there isn't anyone around to ask, and the bit of healthy skepticism. The instinct to pause and quietly ask, does this actually make sense? In a world that feels faster and louder every year, those might be surprisingly valuable skills. But what do you think? Which of these feels most worth learning from Generation X? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like it and subscribe to the channel for more insights into psychology and human behavior. And as always, Thank you for watching.